Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my image quality breakdown on this new beast from Sigma, the 60 to 600 millimeter F4.5 to 6.3. And this is, I think most likely, as some have pointed out correctly, I believe the replacement for the lens that was affectionately known as the Bigma, the 50-500 millimeter zoom lens from Sigma. And so they've done a little bit of tweaking here to the actual focal length, and I think arguably a more appealing focal length. I mean, giving up that 10 millimeters on the wide end to gain 100 millimeters on the long end, I think is a trade-off that most people would be willing to make. If you missed my first look episode, I broke down the build, the handling of things on this lens itself, and so I encourage you to take a look at that. Today, however, I'm going to give you a detailed look at the image quality, because this is where I personally wanted to know, and I know a lot of you wanted to know, is how good has Sigma done with giving us a big focal length here, a really big zoom ratio, while still upholding image quality. And so we're going to jump in and take a look at that. The first thing to note is that this lens, like other recent Sigma releases, is compatible with Canon's lens aberration correction. And so JPEGs will be corrected in camera. This is a RAW file, and so it arrives uncorrected, so it lets us see what needs some help here. So at 60 millimeters, you can definitely see some fairly prominent barrel distortion that is there, and also some vignette off into the edges. And so, vignette is there, but it's not massive either. And so certainly, applying a standard profile will help to correct all that and straighten things out. Looking in the center of the frame at 60 millimeters, f4.5, a few observations. First of all, things look fairly sharp there. There's nice, crisp textures. I would say that contrast doesn't look too bad. If we move off towards the edge, we can see there's a little bit of fall off. It's definitely not as sharp. Textures are not quite as crisp, but at the same time, it doesn't look terrible off towards the edges either. And, and that's true across the frame. Now, if you'll look at this area right here, and this right here, and then here, you're going to see, whoops, let's go back there. You are going to see a little bit of lateral chromatic aberration that is showing up. And so that is part of the nature of the beast here. You can see purple and green both showing up. And so that is some lateral chromatic aberration that shows up mostly on the periphery of the frame. Now we can see, stop down to f5.6 on the right, that vignette is basically already naturally cleared up, and so nothing really to be concerned about there. Looking towards the center of the frame, there is, there's not a whole lot in the center of the frame to take away from this. I mean, it may have a hair more contrast and sharpness, but I don't think it's really going to show up much in a field kind of setting. And off at the edge of the frame, there is a extremely mild improvement, but as you can see, it is not significant. I would say our biggest optical change here is some vignette lift and maybe just a little better micro contrast. You can see that, whites look whiter and darks look a little bit darker. And so that's our major improvement. Stopped on down to f8, global image looks pretty much the same, not a significant difference. Center of the frame, I would say textures look a hair crisper, a little bit improvement of contrast there, so I'm going to guess f8 is going to represent a fairly optimal aperture. A mild improvement, once again, very mild along the edge of the frame. Again, there's a little extra information here, a little crisper textures. And you can tell that this is lateral chromatic aberration. You can still see that green there. And lateral chromatic aberration is not affected by aperture. Longitudinal chromatic aberration, typically when the lens is stopped down, it begins to clear up. Lateral, just the nature of it, it stays the same. The good news about lateral CA is that it is the kind that clears up with that one click in Lightroom or ACR or something similar. It's very easy to correct for. But what we're seeing here at f8 is just a more even performance really everywhere across the frame. It's not major, but there is a minor improvement there. So if we move on to 100 millimeters, note that maximum aperture is now f5, and so aperture starting to close down a little bit. We can see also that that distortion has essentially corrected itself. You can see the most minor amount of barrel distortion that's still there, but it's negligible. It's not going to impact anything. We can also see that vignette is virtually non-existent. I mean, you can look over at the f5.6 image, and frankly, it really doesn't hardly look any different. Looking at the center of the frame with both of these side by side, obviously going from f5 to f5.6 is not significant, and so we're only talking about a third stop there, so don't expect a huge improvement, and that's when we see that there's not. I mean, there's a mild amount of improved contrast there. This looks better towards the edge of the frame than what it did at 60 millimeters. And, you know, surprisingly here, even though it's only 1/3 stop, I definitely do see an improvement at f5.6 along the edge of the frame, where frankly at f5.6, it looks pretty fantastic. Stopping on down to f8, we can see only a, you know, globally, it looks pretty much the same. Looking in the center of the frame, I mean, maybe you can spot a difference that I don't. If there is one, it's not significant in the center of the frame. On the right of the frame, it is also, you know, virtually the same, because it already looked pretty great at f5.6. And so you can see just a little bit brighter, maybe the tiniest bit of vignette lift, but I think this is more just an improvement in contrast as it stopped down. So you get a little bit brighter whites and a little bit darker dark areas. So if we move on to 150 millimeters-ish, we will see that, you know, there's basically no distortion and basically no vignette to speak of. Maximum aperture has already closed to f5.6. And so, you know, just note that throughout a lot of the focal range, you're going to be at the smaller end of the maximum aperture here. That was also true of the 150 to 600 millimeter Sport, which, you know, lost light fairly quickly. And that was one of the things that I did nick on that when I reviewed it. Otherwise, you know, pretty excellent optically. As we look here comparing f5.6 and f8, there is very, very little difference. Resolution is about the same, a little bit better contrast at f8. You can see, for example, in this area, just a tiniest bit of a haze, whereas they're a little bit crisper on the right side. Moving off to the edge of the frame, we can definitely see an uptick in the resolution off of the edge of the frame. And so center of the frame, you're going to see so little a difference that it would be hard to measure. But on the right side of the frame, you definitely can see, or the edges, I should say in general, you're definitely going to see an improvement, and that's fairly obvious as you push it out towards the corners. Now, one challenge with small aperture zoom lenses like this one is that, you know, to significantly stop down at all, even 2 stops, you're at f11. The problem is that with a lot of camera bodies, this is on a 5D Mark IV, you're already pretty well past the diffraction limit. And so diffraction is, while it might be minor, it is a mitigating factor to increasing sharpness. And so it's kind of a catch-22. You know, often stopping down a lens produces more sharpness, but the further you get past that diffraction limit, the more that diffraction comes into play. You know, you can't beat physics when it comes to that. At the same time, I mean, looking at this f11 versus the f8, I mean, I don't think the f11 looks any worse. But I also don't know that it looks any better either, and, you know, probably for those mitigating factors that we just discussed. So anyway, I mean, you can stop on down for more depth of field perhaps, but, you know, as you can see, it's not going to make a big difference optically. Now at 300 millimeters, once again-ish, fortunately, we have not lost that last 1/3 of a stop yet. So we're still at f5.6 at this point. And so as far as our sharpness goes, we still have a nice center performance. You can see there's a little bit of haze that's impacting some of those textures and reducing just a little bit of contrast, but, you know, really that actually looks quite good. Moving off to the side of the frame, we do see a drop-off taking place. Now, there is also a possibility of a depth of field being impacted, and some of this in a more significant way due to the fact that this is we're going to get into increasingly long focal length, and so byproduct of that is depth of field becomes pretty small at our test distance, which is about 20 feet. And so what you can see here is that, you know, there is some loss of sharpness towards the edge, and we do see an improvement at f8, but it is hard to distinguish what is actual optical from, perhaps depth of field. The amount of difference I see at f8 makes me suspect that it probably is maybe a combination of both some optical improvements that would follow the pattern that we've seen, along with slightly increased depth of field. But I mean, basically you've got a very sharp center and a less sharp edge of the frame out at that last bit. We stop on down to f11 here. We can see there is actually a little bit of increase in contrast in the center of the frame, and so there is still some gain to be seen 2 stops down. And also we can see there is a gain at the edge of the frame. And again, what's the cart or the horse here? I'm not sure, but there is a noticeable improvement in our edge of the frame performance at f11. So here we are at 400 millimeters, once again ish. It's a little bit hard to perfectly line this up just using the markers on the lens itself, and so but we're in the ballpark there. So what we can see here, a few things. Number one, over this last little bit, we have seen that we're maintaining a basically distortion-free performance. And even still here, if there's any pin cushion there, I can't visually see it, so it's not worth talking about. We are now at the smallest maximum aperture of f6.3. And just to clarify for those of you that might be concerned, f6.3 lenses like these are designed to where they will work on all of the DSLRs that have a mount that they will fit on. And so if you've heard, well, my lens will only autofocus, or my camera will only autofocus at a maximum aperture of f5.6. This is only a 1/3 stop difference, and through some digital trickery, the camera basically thinks it's focusing at f5.6, and typically focus is fine, no issues, and I've done lots of tests on that, and it's always been the case. So non-issue basically. Looking here at the center of the frame, we can see once again there is some haze affecting textures mildly. You can see an uptick in the contrast there, a little bit extra resolution, but it's mostly about improved contrast when you go down that. In this case, we're not even going a full stop, we're going 2/3 of a stop. And so from 6.3 to f8. But you can definitely see a difference. And I am a little less inclined to think that at our last thing that it was all about the depth of field, because we can see here that we actually have gotten a little bit more even performance moving out towards the edge here at 400 millimeters than we did at around 300 millimeters, and it certainly wouldn't be because depth of field has increased. And so I think it's more the nature of the focal length. But what we are seeing is that, stop down to f8, we do have a fairly good edge performance, but right off into the corners, we lose a little bit there. But, you even move in a little bit to right here, and you can definitely see some improvement, better contrast, etc. Now at f8 versus f11, that extra stop makes negligible difference in the center of the frame. I doubt in the real world there is a little bit better contrast than here, a little less haze, but it's so minor that, this test is designed to highlight those flaws, and I don't think that you would see them out in real world performance. You can see, however, a little bit of improved contrast and resolution out here, and if we look off into that extreme corner, it's not perfect, obviously, but it's better than what it was. One other thing that I want you to direct your attention to, and that is that what we're not seeing, and we basically didn't see a whole lot of after 100 millimeters, is that lateral chromatic aberration. It's just not visible here. And so that's a factor at the wider portion of the focal range, not so much at the telephoto end. Now, if we push on to 500 millimeters, once again, an even greater-ish, and I did have that lined up on the 500 millimeter mark, but it's obviously not incredibly precise. I retract that statement. There is a 400 millimeter mark and there is a 600 millimeter mark. I tried to split the difference. That's as good as I got. One thing I do want to point out is we are starting to see a little bit more vignette starting to creep in. If you look down at these thumbnails, you can see it. And so if we go back here, 300 millimeters, very little comparatively. At 400 millimeters, you're seeing it a bit more. At 500 millimeters, more yet. And then over here, 600 millimeters, we see a little bit more. Not a big deal because it's not extreme. It corrects fairly easily. And if you're shooting JPEGs, it will internally correct. But just note that is, as you go deeper into it, it starts to increase. In terms of resolution and contrast, again, it's mostly contrast that improves as you stop the lens down. You can see some haze on those textures that is improving. You can see whites getting whiter and darks getting darker. And that's what we're primarily seeing. If we go off towards the edge of the frame, we can see that, resolution does start to drop off right at that last bit. And it looks a little bit better, not a whole lot of improved resolution, a little bit more brightness, I think, due to vignette lift stop down. And that allows, better contrast. The extreme corners are a little bit soft, as you can see. And so that, could be depth of field a little bit. But because there's not a whole lot of distortion here, I'm inclined to believe it's more just fall off in general in terms of resolution. So stopping on down to f11, we'll see if that gives us any kind of noticeable improvement. In the center of the frame, it doesn't that I can see. Moving off to the edge here, I see the most minor of improvements. Let's go down instead of up this time. You can see off as we push towards the corners, there is some improvement, but we still, right towards the extreme edges, we are starting to lose it a bit even at f11. But if you come back a little bit, this definitely looks better on this side than what this does. So finally we arrive at the end, 600 millimeters, and so we can see that we're definitely framing in tighter and tighter as we go. So good news is that means that I don't think that focus breathing is a serious issue here. I haven't seen anything to indicate that it is. Stepping back out for a second, you can see that that vignette is, more impactful here. Center of the frame, it's essentially the same pattern that we've seen, a little loss of contrast and then a minor improvement at f8 as we move off towards the edge of the frame. In some ways here it doesn't look any worse, and moving off towards the corners, it doesn't look any worse than what we have seen. So it's not like there's any kind of major drop off. The first generation Tamron 150 to 600 millimeter, there's a pretty significant drop off between 500 millimeters and 600 millimeters. I don't see that here. We've seen kind of a similar pattern. What you mostly see stopping the lens down a bit is some improved contrast, and just the textures are allowed to shine a little bit more. Our final stop at f11. In the center of the frame, I actually think there's a mild regression from f8 to f11. f8 seems to be a pretty good aperture, and even here along the edge, I think there's a minor improvement on the edge at f8. Or excuse me, f11, but again, it's not a significant one. And so, you're just gonna have to kind of make a pick about your priority. I think you lose a little bit of center sharpness going to f11, you gain a little bit of edge. So it might depend on your subject matter. Now, it's not unusual for lenses with an extreme focal ratio like this to be sharper in the, kind of center portions of its focal range, away from the extremes. And I think that that's true here. The shots that have most stood out to me, for example, this is about 160 millimeters, and that looks really impressively sharp to me. Just a lot of detail rendered there, very crisp, particularly since we're shooting indoors. And let's just take a quick look here. We're shooting at ISO 3200, and so, that's a pretty nice shot there. Now taking a look at another, this is an outdoor shot at 300 millimeters, and as you can see, nice detail in here, and in fact, looking in her eye, we've got my house reflected quite well in there. And so anyway, lots of nice detail there. I certainly would not be dissatisfied at all with that at 300 millimeters handheld. Now here's a shot at 400 millimeters, and so clicking into a pixel level here, we can see a lot of nice crisp textures on that, and good contrast. Stepping back and looking at the image globally, it looks nice and crisp. Good global contrast, and and you can also see here there's lots of shiny, icy, reflective surfaces where a lot of longitudinal chromatic aberrations would show up, and they're not. And so, the lens is doing quite a good job on those metrics. At 600 millimeters, I'm a little less impressed. And I think you would find, although I don't have the opportunity to compare them directly right now, that the 150 to 600 millimeter sport lens is going to give you a sharper result at 600 millimeters. As you can see at a pixel level, and by the way, this was shot off of a tripod. It was shot with a live view to make sure that focus was correct. And I also shot a series of these shots to, get a baseline. So this represented, I would say best case scenario. And you can just see that while, you can certainly, you can count her. If counting eyelashes is your thing, you can do that. You can also see, however, that, it isn't particularly crisp on some of these textures. There is some haze there, even towards the center of the frame. And so I do think that the 150-600 Sport gives a little sharper results at the long end. Here's another example here at 600 millimeters. So I'm going to give you, good case, bad case scenario when it comes to this. There's not chromatic aberrations that are marring the, the cutoff line, as they transition. If you look along here, we've got a really bright area, and you can see the most minor amount of purple fringing, but it's essentially a non-issue. No lateral chromatic aberration over on this side. All of that stuff is good. Contrast looks good. I think the color looks good, and I think that Sigma has often done a good job with these long telephotos and their color. You can see that the bokeh is a little bit busy, particularly considering how much we're compressing the background here. You can just see some busyness and definitely some deformation of shapes along the edges. And also, looking here, I'm not wowed by the amount of detail showing up in that leaf there. And so, that's the trade-off. 600 millimeters is acceptably good. It's certainly not exceptionally good. I did want to take a look at this, and I'll examine autofocus more in the final review episode. But I did find, number one, that I was able to, for this indoor basketball game, and obviously a variable aperture lens like this is not a top pick for indoor sports. Mostly, it says sports in the name, but it needs a lot of light. I made this work I just set ISO at 12,800, and so I could get a 1/500th shutter speed to make sure to freeze action. That being said, no problem in stopping action here with the autofocus and keeping up with things. I felt like I didn't have a problem with that. The other thing that was interesting is that I went back and I looked at the kind of action shots that I liked best from this, and I wasn't there for a long time, maybe 20 minutes. I'm just noticing Steph Curry on his socks. That's funny. Anyway, but at the same time, I observed that all of these shots that I liked best were actually shot at under 150 millimeters. And so, right near that, but a little under that. So there's two takeaways from that. The first positive takeaway is that all of these shots that I really liked from this event, I wouldn't have gotten if I had one of the 150-600 millimeter lenses. But of course, the downside of that is that it also means I could have gotten these shots with a 70-200 millimeter f2.8, for example, and been able to shoot at a much lower ISO setting. So, good and bad. Now, there's one final thing I want to highlight that's kind of interesting that I had to learn by discovery. And so I did a bit of a double take when I was doing the first look episode, and I saw that that the minimum focus distance was so reduced from the 150-600 millimeter Sport. And it didn't sit right with me because I don't remember that being the case when I had been out shooting with the lens prior to that. And that's because it's not, at least at 600 millimeters. Here at 600 millimeters, the minimum focus distance is about the same. I found that for example, to get focused here, and so I'm at the bare minimum here, that I had to back up to about 8.5 feet, which is essentially what the minimum focus distance is on the Sport lens. I noted that when I reduced the focal length, however, that I was able to start getting closer to the subject and starting to get a tighter framing and a more blurred background. So that was interesting. This is at 400 millimeters. And so I continued to experiment and then discovered that the tightest framing and the best, kind of magnification ratio, and you can see it looks quite good here at this close focus distance, is actually at 200 millimeters. And so the marketing there is a little bit deceptive because it's not like you can get that close to the subject at 600 millimeters. You actually can specifically do that at 200 millimeters. And so there are actually varying minimum focus distances depending upon the focal length that you select. And so, I mean, it's fine for doing this kind of shot, but at the same time in the field, you may be a little more limited than what you might expect in that you can't get any closer at 600 millimeters to a subject than what you could with the 150 to 600 Sport. And so, in many ways, I think that Sigma has done a pretty able job with this lens. Optically, it remains fairly good throughout the focal range. I do think that at 600 millimeters, it maybe leaves a little bit to be desired. And I do think that either the 150, really any of the 150 to 600 millimeter lenses are probably going to be a little bit stronger at 600 millimeters as compared with this lens. Now, that's not to say that the image quality is not useful, but I think, in particular, I found the 150 to 600 millimeter Sport lens to be very, very usable, probably as good as any of them that I've seen of these variable, these actual zoom lenses that reach 600 millimeters. I think that has probably been the best optically on the long end, and I don't think that this lens is quite there. I think that probably both the Sport and Contemporary and probably the Tamron G2 are all stronger at 600 millimeters. And so if that's your shooting priority, you might want to look at one of those lenses. If you want, to be able to carry one lens that's going to allow you to go from, moderately wide, enough to where in many situations you'll be able to get a landscape or a group type shot and then go all the way to that extreme zoom. This is a pretty appealing lens. It's got a lot of things going on for it. Now, in the final episode that will be coming to you shortly, I'll be covering things like autofocus in a little bit more detail and covering that. I have thrown an extender on there, and I'll cover that a little bit, talk to you about that behavior, and also give you a little bit more highlights on how it worked with things like the EOS R and via the MC11 on the Sony a7R Mark III, and just maybe answer some of those other questions along the periphery as a part of that final verdict. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, of course, you can check out the image gallery if you'll look in the link in the description down below, and I would encourage you to go and to look at that. Of course, beyond that, you can also find buying links if you want to purchase one for yourself. You can follow me on social media or sign up for my newsletter. There's something that comes out every week, and then about every month I give you a more detailed newsletter, and so if you want to take a look and sign up for that, you can do that as well. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.